The man in the hollow has his hand flat against the bark of a white oak, and he is not measuring the tree. He is reading it. The bark is light gray, straight, faintly flaky. When he draws his palm down the trunk, small pieces come away against his skin. That is what he walked into the woods to find. A tree that sheds a little bark under a dry hand may split clean all the way down. A tree whose bark twists as it climbs will not, however good it looks from the road. The difference is invisible from 30 feet away, and it cannot be corrected afterward. Everything that follows is settled here. The strips, the ribs, the hoops, the days of work still to come. All of it rests on a judgment made while the tree is still standing. This is how a white oak basket began. Not with weaving, not with a pattern drawn on paper. It began with somebody walking a hillside, looking for one tree among thousands, knowing that a wrong choice meant the wood would tear apart in the hand and the week would be gone. That judgment was made over and over across the southern mountains for the better part of a century. In Middle Tennessee, in eastern Kentucky, in western North Carolina, in West Virginia, in southwestern Virginia, the baskets it produced were not decorations. Eggs were carried in egg baskets. Feed was carried to the stock in feed baskets. Cotton was carried in baskets that stood close to 4 feet tall. Robert Cogswell, who directed the Folklife program at the Tennessee Arts Commission and spent decades interviewing the last of the old makers, put the point plainly. These things were made to be used, not displayed. And they were used until they came apart. That is the reason so few of the earliest ones survive. A basket that worked was a basket that wore out. Here is what makes this craft worth an hour of anyone's attention, and it is not the weaving. Anyone can weave. Splints can be bought by mail today, cut to width, ready to soak. Donald Fan, who ran the Arts Center of Cannon County, has made the distinction bluntly. Order the components, and almost anyone can assemble a basket. What sets this tradition apart is everything that happens before the weaving starts. Finding the tree, felling it, breaking a log down by hand into material thin enough to bend around a rib and strong enough to hold 40 pounds of corn. That work took the skill. That work took the days. So the question this film sets out to answer is not how a basket was woven. It is this: a container that cost a family nothing but their own labor, made from a tree they could cut themselves, strong enough to outlast the person who made it, was one of the most useful objects in an American farmhouse. Whole families in some counties leaned on it to get through the winter. And then, inside a single generation, it was gone. Not forgotten slowly, the way old songs fade, gone, and in some places refused, by the very people who knew best how to make it. Why? The answer is not simple carelessness, and it is not only cheap plastic. Part of it is wood, part of it is economics, and a large part of it, uncomfortably, is shame, documented in the words of the makers themselves. We will get there, but it starts in the woods, because the whole craft is a chain, and the first link is a tree. White oak is not chosen out of habit. It is chosen because of how it comes apart. Cut across the end of a fresh log, and the growth rings show as pale circles, one for each year the tree lived. In early spring, the tree lays down wide, thin-walled fibers, weak and open. Later in the season, the cells tighten and thicken. That later wood is dense and springy, and it is the layer that becomes the woven strip. The weak spring layer between the rings is the seam a person exploits. Drive a blade into it, and the wood will separate along the ring, sheet by sheet, without ever being cut. That is the entire principle. A white oak basket is not sawn. It is peeled apart along lines the tree drew itself. Wood split with the grain is stronger than wood sawn across it, because the fibers run unbroken from one end of the strip to the other. A sawn strip has severed fibers along every edge, and snaps where a split strip only bends. The maker in the hollow is not choosing a tree. He is choosing a set of lines already inside it, laid down one summer at a time, and hoping they run straight. They very often do not. To understand why a family would spend 4 or 5 days of hard work on a container, it helps to walk through what a southern mountain farmstead actually had to move in the course of a year. Eggs from the henhouse to the kitchen, then from the kitchen to the store. Shelled corn to the mill and meal back from it. Feed to the hogs. Apples and potatoes out of the ground and into the cellar hole. Beans to be picked, greens to be gathered, wool to be carried, cotton to be dragged down a row. Wet washing out to the line. Kindling in. Every one of those jobs needed something to carry it in, and every one of them wanted something different. Tin existed. So did glass, and galvanized buckets, and wooden kegs. They could all be bought, which was the problem. Cash on a hillside farm was scarce and seasonal. A basket could be made instead of bought, from a tree standing on the place, using tools already in the shed. That was its real advantage. It cost labor, and labor was the one thing a large family had a surplus of, especially in winter when the fields were finished. So the basket was not one object. It was a whole family of objects, and the mountains built them in three broad ways. The first is the ribbed basket, and it is the one most people picture when they think of Appalachia. It begins with two hoops, one forming the rim and one forming the handle, crossed at right angles and lashed together where they meet. Curved ribs are then set into that lashing to make a cage, and thin, flexible splits are woven in and out of the ribs from both ends until the two sides meet in the middle. There is no flat bottom in the ordinary sense. The shape comes entirely from the length of the ribs. The second is the split basket, which has no rib frame at all. It is built almost wholly from flat splits woven over and under, and it produces the round, square, and rectangular forms, including the big rough field and cotton baskets. The third is wicker, woven from vines and rods rather than flat wood. They were named the way farm tools are named, which is to say bluntly, after what they did or what they looked like. Ribbed baskets were called egg baskets, potato baskets, melon baskets, butterfly baskets, fanny baskets. Split baskets were often named for standard measures: a pint basket, a quart basket, a gallon basket, because that is what they held and how they were bought and sold. Wicker baskets were named for the job: a sewing basket, a corn basket. Nobody was naming them for a catalog. The material choice was equally practical. Hickory, maple, elm, and yellow poplar were all used across West Virginia and the wider region, and so were honeysuckle, grapevine, wisteria, Virginia creeper, willow, and cattail. But white oak dominated, and it dominated for three reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment. It was abundant, it was strong, and it lasted, in daily use, for years. There is one more thing about it that mattered enormously and is easy to miss. White oak could be worked with what a farm already owned: an axe, a froe or a heavy knife, a pocketknife. No lathe, no saw bench, no purchased material. In a region where the nearest store credit was a day's walk away, a craft that required nothing but a tree and a blade had an obvious advantage over one that did not. It is worth being precise here about whose craft this was, because the popular picture flattens two very different histories into one. Basketry in the southern Appalachians is far older than the white oak tradition. Cherokee weavers worked river cane, a native plant of the bamboo family, and surviving fragments carry the practice back centuries before European settlement. A double weave fragment from Berea County, Tennessee, has been dated to around 1500, and a single weave fragment from Monroe County to around 1450. River cane is difficult, hard, and tough, and has to be kept wet while it is worked. Cherokee weavers had been doing it for as long as memory ran. The white oak rod and narrow splint tradition is a different lineage. Scholars place its origin in Europe, carried across the Atlantic by settlers from Britain and Ireland, and adapted to American trees. It later entered Cherokee basketry as well, during the 19th century, as access to the old canebrakes narrowed, and weavers turned to what the mountain land still offered. Two traditions then, running alongside each other, sometimes crossing. What follows in this film is the settler tradition in white oak, and it began, as Albert Thomas of Cannon County described his own community, as one skill among several. If you were not a chair maker, you were a basket maker, or something like it. It was a way of surviving. The good trees are not on the ridge. Basket timber grows where the soil is rich and deep, and the light is even. That means hollows, bottomland, and the lower part of a slope, facing north or east. It usually stands in mature forest, mixed in with hickories and other oaks, because those are the conditions that produce what a basket maker actually needs, which is not a big tree. It is a slow, straight, patient tree that has grown without interruption and without leaning. Size is the first filter, and it runs the opposite way to most people's instincts. Bobby Edwards, a Cannon County basket maker who learned the work from the older generation, describes the ideal as about the size of a stovepipe, not a mighty oak, a pole. Trees from roughly 4 to 10 inches through can be split successfully, and a smaller one, 4 to 6 inches, is easier to handle at every stage. Standing in front of a fine, straight oak measuring 10 or 12 inches through, Edward's judgment is that it is a little too big to use, and he leaves it. 2 reasons. A larger log has to be split much further before it becomes workable material, and a larger log has to be carried out of the woods on a person's shoulder. A tree that size is better left to grow into saw timber. So the maker walks past trees a lumberman would take, and stops at ones a lumberman would ignore. Then comes the bark, and this is where the real reading happens. What is wanted is bark that is light gray, straight up the trunk, and slightly flaky. A hand run down a good tree will bring loose flakes away against the palm. That surface texture is a signal about the wood underneath. What disqualifies a tree is bark that twists as it rises, because the fibers inside are following that same spiral, and a spiral will not yield a long straight split. Obvious knots are out, burrs are out, low branching is out, because every branch is a knot waiting inside the trunk. Any sign of disease or insect damage is out. A single small knot on one side can sometimes be worked around, if nothing better can be found in a day's walking. Nothing else can. There is one more rejection, and it is the least obvious of them. A tree that leans is a bad tree, even if the bark is perfect and the trunk is clear. When a tree leans, it braces itself. It lays down reaction wood on the upper side, wood held permanently in tension as it pulls the trunk back toward vertical. That tension does not disappear when the tree is felled. The wood twists as it is worked, dries unevenly, and shrinks along its length, rather than only across it. A maker who takes a leaning tree finds it out 3 days later, when the strips will not lie flat and will not stay the size they were cut. That is the cost of the wrong choice. Not a wasted afternoon, a wasted week, discovered too late to start over before the weather turns. Cut the tree and the inside confirms or destroys the judgment made outside it. The end grain shows a dark center and a lighter ring around it. The dark center is heartwood, wood that was once living sapwood and has since gone inert, serving now as structure and as a reservoir for tannin and other chemicals. It is hard, it is stubborn, and for basket work it is largely useless. The lighter outer ring is sapwood, made up of long, hollow fibers that were carrying water and nutrients between the roots and the leaves right up until the axe went in. That is the material a basket is made of. The end grain also exposes any knots, because a knot begins at the pith in the very center of the heartwood and travels outward as the buried remains of a limb. The wood around it is distorted in every direction. On a cut end, a knot is a verdict. Then the log has to come home. On steep ground, with no road and no help, that is not a small matter. It is common to split a log in half where it lies, simply to make it possible to carry, which is why a maul and a set of wooden or iron wedges belong in the woods rather than in the shed. There is a last condition, and it is not about wood at all. For much of this period, mountain forest was treated as effectively common ground. If a family needed basket timber, they went and found it, cut it and carried it home, and whose deed covered that particular hillside was not the governing question. Donald Fan has described exactly that arrangement, and described what replaced it. Fences, posted boundaries, ownership enforced. Hold on to that. It becomes one of the reasons this craft could not simply continue. The pole is home. It is lying across 2 blocks in the dooryard, bark on, 4 feet of clean white oak, and it now has to become several hundred strips of wood thinner than a knife blade. There is one rule that governs the whole operation, and it sounds so simple that its importance is easy to miss. You always split in half. Not a third off one side, not a thin strip taken from the outside, down the middle, every time. Bobby Edwards states the reason directly. Halving gives you equal leverage. When a blade is driven into wood, the split does not travel wherever you point it. It travels toward the weaker side. If one half is thicker and stiffer than the other, the thin side gives way, the crack curves outward, and the split runs off the edge of the piece, long before it reaches the far end. 2 halves of equal mass push back against each other equally, and the split runs straight, because nothing is pulling it aside. That is the whole of it. Every decision downstream obeys that one piece of physics. So the sequence is a series of halvings. Josie Jones, another Cannon County maker, described the order the way it lives in the hands. Take the whole pole and go down it, half and half. Take one of those halves and split it down the middle again. Take that and quarter it. Then split down again. Take the heart out, and after that make the rest any size you want. A 4-inch pole becomes 2 halves. The halves become quarters. The quarters become what Edwards calls pie shapes, narrow wedges with bark on the wide end and the pith at the point. The halving continues until the pieces are small enough to be pulled apart by hand, rather than driven apart with a tool. On a good pole, that is a matter of a great many cuts, and Edwards admits in the middle of the work that he has lost count of how many times the wood has already been divided. Then the heart comes out, and this is the first serious loss. The center of the log, the pith and the wood immediately around it, is tough, brittle, and unworkable. It will not bend, and it will not split cleanly. It is cut away and thrown down. Alongside it goes the heartwood, the dark inner wood, which is separated from the pale sapwood and set aside. On a stovepipe-sized pole, the difference is easy to see on the cut end and easy to feel under the blade. The dark wood resists. The pale wood yields. The bark and the layers just under it go too, stripped off during the splitting. In the warmer months, when the cambium beneath the bark is active and moist, the bark comes away with almost no effort at all. Count what is left. A tree carried down a hillside on somebody's shoulder yields, after all this, only the pale sapwood between the heart and the bark. Everything else is on the ground. Now the difficult part begins, and it is not brute force. It is steering. A split does not stay honest by itself. It wanders. As the crack travels down the piece, it drifts toward one face, and if nothing is done, it will surface, and the strip will be lost. The maker's answer is leverage, applied against the drift. The piece is braced, commonly against a knee, and the thicker side is bent away, which loads the fibers on that side and pulls the crack back toward the center. Edwards describes exactly this as he works, watching the split, correcting it, drawing the wood back toward himself so that the separation returns to the middle. Watch a skilled person do it, and there is no violence in it at all. There is a knife set into the end grain as a probe, only far enough to open a start, and after that the tool is largely finished. Once the crack is wide enough for fingers, hands take over. The rest is a slow, controlled pulling apart, both arms working, the whole body braced, eyes on the traveling line, rather than on the hands. The wood is talking the entire time. It tells the maker where it wants to go. The maker's job is to disagree with it, gently, for 4 feet. None of this looks like basket making. There is no weaving here, no pattern, no shape. There is a person in a dooryard, surrounded by a growing heap of rejected wood, working through a pole, one halving at a time, and by the end of it there is still not a single finished strip. There is only material, rough and oversized, waiting for the next stage. This is where the days went, not into the basket, into the wood that would become one. Up to this point, the wood has only been divided. Now it has to be shaped. And to understand how, it helps to see that a piece of white oak can be split in 2 completely different directions, and that each direction controls something different. Split with the growth rings, following one annual layer around the curve of the log, and you are controlling thickness. That is the tangential direction. Each ring peeled off the piece makes the remaining wood thinner. A maker who wants a strip half as thick as the one in his hand does not shave it down. He splits another ring off it, split across the rings instead, straight out from the center toward the bark, and you are controlling width. That is the radial direction, and it follows the rays, the flat plates of cells that run outward from the heart of the tree like spokes. 2 axes, thickness one way, width the other. Everything a basket needs is produced by combining them. Edwards describes the tangential work as it happens. He picks the growth ring he wants, sets the blade on it, and lets the knife follow the ring down the length of the piece. He is not cutting the wood so much as persuading it to remember a line it already contains. He stays in the middle. He braces the piece against his knee and manipulates it, steering the separation whichever way he needs it to go, and the ring peels off as a long pale sheet. The radial direction has to be treated with more caution, because the rays are also the tree's weakness. When wood loses moisture, it splits along the rays. That is called checking, and it is the reason this work cannot be put off. The clock starts the moment the tree comes down. Green wood splits, bends, and behaves. Wood that has been left in the yard a fortnight has begun to dry, and drying wood checks, hardens, and refuses. A basket maker who fells a pole on Monday and gets called away to other work does not come back to the same material. This is one of the invisible pressures on the whole craft, and it explains something about the rhythm of mountain life that is easy to miss. Basket work concentrated in winter, not only because the fields were idle, but because the work had to be done in a run, without interruption, once it began. Now comes the allocation, and this is a genuinely difficult judgment. A single pole has to produce 4 different things, and they have 4 incompatible requirements. It has to produce the rim hoop and the handle hoop, which need to be stiff enough to hold a shape permanently, and tough enough to take the whole weight of a loaded basket. It has to produce the ribs, which need to bend into a curve and then stay there. And it has to produce the weavers, the thin flat splits that do the actual weaving, which need to be as thin and flexible as the maker can make them without tearing. 1 tree, 4 jobs, stiffness at one end of the scale, extreme flexibility at the other. That is what a Tennessee apprentice is still taught to do today. Locate the tree, harvest the pole, and break the log into rims, handles, ribs, and weavers. The order of those words is the order of the work, and the decision about which portion of the pole becomes which component is made in the first hour, before the finer splitting starts. It is reasonable to conclude, though the old makers rarely spelled it out, that the straightest and most consistent wood was reserved for the weavers, since they are split thinnest and take the most punishment during weaving, and that heavier, stiffer stock went to hoops and ribs. What is directly documented is the standard the weavers had to meet. They were split and then shaved thoroughly, because they had to be the thinnest and most flexible parts of the basket, and because a rough split left sticking out inside the basket would tear whatever the basket carried. That is a working detail worth pausing on. The finish on the inside of an egg basket was not decoration. It was there so the basket would not break the eggs. And the yield, when the splitting goes well, is genuinely large. Standing over a pole he has just opened, watching the pale wood come off ring after ring, Edward's assessment is simple and satisfied. This will make a lot of baskets. A tree a man could carry out of the woods on his shoulder, reduced to a heap of scrap and a pile of pale strips, turns out to hold far more material than it appears to. But none of those strips is finished yet. Every one of them is still rough, still uneven, still oversized. Which brings us to the knife, and to the part of the work that took the longest and left the least to show for it. If you had stood in a Cannon County yard on a working morning, the first thing you would have noticed was not a sight. It was a sound. A long, dry, repeated scrape. Wood being drawn across steel, over and over, hour after hour. That sound is the craft. And the technique behind it reverses what most people assume about knife work. The blade does not travel. Edwards demonstrates it plainly. The knife is held flat and still, and the wood is pulled underneath it. The hand holding the strip does the moving. The hand holding the blade does the judging. There is a good reason for that. A knife pushed along a 4-foot strip will follow every high spot and every soft patch, and the strip will come out uneven. A blade held at a fixed angle, while the wood is drawn steadily through, works like a gauge. It removes whatever stands proud and leaves whatever does not. The thickness is set by the geometry of the hold rather than by the strength of the stroke, and it can be held consistent along the entire length. That is how a strip becomes even, not by care alone, by turning the hand into a fixed reference. Every split gets this treatment. They are shaved thoroughly, because they have to end up the thinnest and most flexible parts of the finished basket, and because of that functional requirement mentioned earlier, a rough split will stand up inside the weave and tear whatever the basket is carrying. Smoothness here is a specification, not a flourish. Then the strip has to be brought to width, which means running the edges as well as the faces, and any strip that comes out too narrow, too thin, or too torn is thrown on the pile with the bark and the heartwood. Now the hoops. The rim hoop and the handle hoop are the skeleton of a ribbed basket. Everything else hangs off them. They carry the entire load when the basket is lifted, and they hold the shape for as long as the basket exists. And they are made, from start to finish, with a pocket knife. Not a lathe, not a plane, a knife, worked patiently until the hoop reaches the length, the width, and the smoothness the maker wants. Length determines the size of the basket. Width determines its stiffness. Smoothness determines whether the lashing will sit tight against it or slip. Then the strip is bent into a ring. The overlap is fitted, and it is tied or pegged and left until it holds its own curve. The handle hoop takes the same treatment and one extra consideration, because it is the part a hand will close around several thousand times. Any ridge left on it will be felt every single time. The ribs are whittled individually. Each one is tapered at both ends so it can be pushed into the lashing and held there, and each one is cut to a specific length, because the length of a rib is the shape of the basket. Longer ribs, deeper belly. Shorter ribs, shallower dish. A maker changing the size of a basket is not changing a pattern. He is changing a set of measurements he carries in his head and checks by eye. Add all of this up, and a difficult truth about the craft becomes visible. Almost everything in it happens before anything looks like a basket. Finding the tree, felling it, carrying it out, having it down, riving to thickness and width, shaving, sizing, whittling ribs, bending hoops. Days of concentrated work. And at the end of all of that, a stranger walking into the yard would see a heap of wood shavings and a person sitting with a knife. Robert Cogswell has put his finger on precisely this problem. Traditional basket makers, he points out, work from the tree. They make their own material. The skill involved in hand-splitting white oak weavers has no equivalent in the training of a schooled artist, and because of that, it goes almost entirely unrecognized by observers from the art world, who see only the object at the end. Neighbors did not always see it either. Hold that thought, because it turns into something harder later on. For now, look at what is on the bench. 2 bent hoops holding their curve, a fan of whittled ribs, graded by length, coils of pale weavers, thin enough to bend around a finger, smooth on both faces, all cut from one pole that was standing on a hillside a week ago. None of it is fastened to anything. There is no basket yet. There is a kit of parts, made entirely by hand from a single tree, by somebody who never measured anything with a rule. The next stage takes about a minute, and it decides whether all of it holds together. 2 hoops. One becomes the rim, one becomes the handle. Slide one inside the other and turn them until they cross at right angles, and a basket has a skeleton. The 2 crossing points are called the ears, and they are the most demanding piece of engineering in the whole object. Consider what happens there. When a loaded basket is lifted, every ounce of weight travels up the sides, into the rim, around to the 2 points where the handle meets it, and up through the handle into the hand. 4 arms of wood converge at each ear. 2 arms of rim running away in opposite directions. 1 arm of handle going up, 1 going down inside the basket. All the force in the system passes through those 2 small junctions. They are not nailed. They are not glued. They are not jointed. They are tied. The method is a wrapping, known widely as a God's eye, and it is built by taking a length of split and winding it around the 4 arms in a repeating sequence, moving from one arm to the next, over and around, laying each pass beside the one before. As the wrapping builds outward from the center, the successive turns form a diamond that grows across the junction until all 4 arms are locked together. It does 2 things at once, and the second is easy to overlook. The obvious job is clamping. Every turn adds friction between the hoops. Wound tight and wound green, the wrapping grips as the wood dries and shrinks onto itself, and the crossing cannot rack or twist. The joint gets stronger with age rather than weaker. The less obvious job is that the wrapping builds a platform. On the inside face of the basket, the layered turns create a small ledge or pocket at each ear, and that ledge is where the ends of the ribs will sit. The ear is not only a fastening, it is the socket that holds the whole rib cage. Now, the wrapping is functional, but it is also where a maker signs the work. In Cannon County, there is a specific version, still taught today, known as the Cannon County tie, an X pattern with a vertical bar woven across the point where the handle meets the rim, on both sides. A basket carrying that mark can be placed geographically by anyone who knows the tradition. Elsewhere, the ears run to other patterns, and the number of turns, the tightness, the exact geometry, all vary from hand to hand. Donald Fan has described this as the real distinction of the craft, taking a tree, making the components, and building them into a basket that carries the maker's own signature and subtlety. There were no maker's marks stamped into these baskets. The ear was the signature. With both ears wrapped, the ribs go in. They are pushed into the ledge behind the wrapping, points first, and the first ones set are the primary ribs, a small number on each side of the center. They are not yet held by anything except friction and the pocket. At this stage, the frame is loose and unconvincing, a cage of curved sticks that will fall apart if handled roughly. So the maker weaves a few rows immediately, over and under, from both ears, purely to lock those first ribs in position. Only once they are anchored do the secondary ribs go in between them, filling out the cage. More weaving, more ribs, if the basket calls for them. Everything about that sequence is judgment rather than instruction. How many ribs? How long each one? Whether they are evenly spread between rim and handle. The old makers did not count, they looked. Set the frame down on a flat surface, and it tells you the truth immediately. If the basket leans, the rib lengths are wrong, and the time to fix it is now, before a single weaver has committed the shape. That is the point of no return in a white oak basket. Ribs can be pulled and replaced while the frame is bare. Once the weaving is well started, a wrong rib is permanent. And notice what is holding this object together. No metal, no adhesive, no fixings of any kind. 2 bent rings, a set of tapered sticks, and a length of wood wrapped tightly around a crossing. The entire structure is friction, tension, and geometry. It works because it is under load from the moment it is built. The hoops push outward, the ribs push against the wrapping squeezes inward, and every element is pressing against every other. Take the tension out, and it becomes a pile of sticks. Keep the tension in, and it will carry potatoes for 30 years. Which raises the question the whole craft finally turns on. Where does that tension come from? The answer is not the tools, it is the hands. A ribbed basket is not woven from the bottom up, it is woven from both ends inward. The maker starts at one ear, works a run of weaving out along the ribs, then moves to the other ear and does the same. Back and forth, alternating, each side creeping toward the center, until the 2 woven faces finally meet somewhere in the middle of the basket. Weavers describe the joining as being done on the outside wherever possible, so that the inside surface stays clean. The stroke itself could not be simpler. Over one rib, under the next, around the rim, back the other way. A child can learn the motion in 5 minutes. What a child cannot learn in 5 minutes is the tension. Here is why it matters so much, and it follows from the structure described a moment ago. In a ribbed basket, there is nothing holding the ribs apart except the weaving. No frame between them, no fixings, no spacers. Each pass of a weaver crosses the ribs and pulls them into position, and the accumulated grip of all those passes is the only thing keeping the cage in shape. The weaver is not decoration laid over a structure. The weaver is the structure. So slack weaving produces a slack basket. The ribs sit loose, they shift under load, and the weight that should be spread across the whole side of the basket concentrates instead on the ears, which are the very points already carrying everything. The basket does not tear in the middle, it fails at the joints. Weaving too hard causes the opposite trouble. Excessive pull bows the ribs out of their intended curve, drags the shape lopsided, and can crack a thin split outright, which means unpicking work already done. The correct pressure is somewhere between, and it has to be the same on the first pass and the 400th, on the left side and the right, at the beginning of the morning and at the end of a long afternoon, when the hands are tired. That consistency is what separates a basket that lasts a generation from one that goes soft in 2 seasons. It cannot be checked with an instrument. It lives in the hands, and it is acquired only by doing it badly for a long time first. The hardest weaving is not in the open middle of the basket. It is close to the ears, where the ribs crowd together. The curve is at its tightest, and the weaver has to turn sharply in a small space without kinking. A split that snaps anywhere will usually snap there. Throughout, the material has to stay damp. Dry oak will not take a tight bend, so the splits are kept wet and worked while they are pliable. And when a weaver runs out, a new one is started, and the change is tucked, where it will not stand proud on the inside. Then comes the last section, and every rib basket maker knows it. The gap in the center narrows with each pass. The remaining space becomes awkward, and the final rows have to be threaded into a closing opening with fingers that no longer fit. Getting those last passes tight, with the same tension as the first ones, is a genuine test. And then it is done, and it should be looked at for what it actually is. The classic ribbed egg basket is not round. It falls into 2 lobes with a dip in the center, a shape that has collected a dozen regional names: gizzard, melon, buttocks, fanny, bun. That form is not a style. Billy Ray Sims, a working white oak basket maker, explains its purpose directly. The round-ribbed lobed shape lets a person carry eggs and other fragile goods safely over the back of a horse, or riding snug against the hip when walking. The dip straddles. The lobes sit either side of a spine or a hip bone and do not swing. The inside is smooth because eggs break. The weave is tight because feed runs out of gaps. The handle is polished because a hand will hold it every day for years. The ears are wrapped tight because that is where it would otherwise fail. Every visible feature answers a specific problem. So fill it. That is the only test that ever mattered. Load it with corn. Lift it by the handle. Feel whether the ears take the weight without twisting. Carry it across a barnyard. Set it down and look at whether it still stands level. If it does, then a standing tree has become a tool, using nothing but an axe, a knife, water, and about a week of somebody's life. Which brings us to the question that decided the fate of the entire craft. And it is not a question about wood at all. What was a week of that work worth? The honest answer is that the record rarely tells us the price. Searching for a firm, verifiable figure for what an ordinary white oak basket sold for in 1900 or 1930 produces very little that can be stated as fact, and this film will not invent one. What the record does preserve, repeatedly and in the maker's own words, is something arguably more useful. It tells us what a basket bought. It bought lamp oil, sugar, coffee, cloth and thread. In Cannon County, the baskets went to the local stores and came back as the things a hillside farm could not grow. And Robert Cogswell puts the arrangement in terms that leave no room for romance. A number of stores would accept baskets in trade for groceries, and a family's ability to get bacon and salt depended on its ability to bring in baskets and do business by trade. That is not pin money. That is the grocery account. The timing was seasonal, and it fitted into the gaps. Cogswell describes whole families turning to basket work, especially in winter, or in any stretch when there was no farm work to be done. It was not a separate career. It was the thing you did when the fields released you. And it was learned young. Many of the finest makers of the last century, Cogswell notes, grew up as girls at the feet of their mothers and grandmothers, learning the craft and contributing to the household income while they learned. A child shaving splits was not playing. She was working. Then there was the second stage of the trade, and it is the part most people never hear about. The baskets did not stay in the mountains. Local men went into peddling, loading up chairs and baskets made by their own families and their neighbors, and carrying them out to other parts of the country to sell. J. Paul Newby, who did exactly that, described the business plainly. He would go around to the people who made them and contract with them in advance. He would tell a maker he would take everything they produced and name the date he would be back for it. His edge over the competition was not price, it was frequency. Buyers came in from out of state to buy Cannon County baskets, but a man driving down from Indiana or across from Kentucky could not do it every week. Newby could, and the makers, he explains, wanted their money immediately. They did not want to wait a month or 2 months. Whoever showed up regularly with cash in hand got the baskets, regardless of what a distant buyer might have paid later. That is a subsistence economy in one sentence. The best price is worthless if you cannot eat until it arrives. From there, the baskets traveled a long way. Baskets and chairs made in Middle Tennessee were sold on in cities including Detroit, Miami, and New York. How large was this? 2 contemporary newspaper accounts survive, one from 1936 and one from 1938, and they give a rare glimpse of scale. One of them contends that in the short mountain area alone, more than 50 families depended on basket making for a significant part of their living. That figure comes from a newspaper of the period, rather than a census, and it should be held as what it is, a contemporary claim, rather than a verified count. But it describes a Depression-era community where basket work was not a curiosity, it was infrastructure. Alongside this rough trade, there grew a second, organized market, and it worked very differently. In western North Carolina, Francis Goodrich established Allanstand Cottage Industries, paying mountain women to work in their own homes and buying the finished pieces one at a time. What began with weaving expanded to include baskets, brooms, chairs, and other handwork. She opened a shop in Asheville in 1908 and sold widely by mail order through the Presbyterian Mission, and in 1913, an order came from Ellen Wilson at the White House. Sources disagree about exactly when Allanstand began, giving dates spread across the late 1890s and into 1902, and that disagreement has not been resolved here. At Berea College in Kentucky, the Fireside Industries had been running since 1893 on the same cottage principle. Baskets of hickory hoops and white oak splits from that program survive in the college's collections, one of them carrying a date of the 27th of May, 1918. In 1937, the Russell Sage Foundation published Alan Eaton's survey of Southern Highland handicrafts, illustrated with Doris Ullman's photographs. Eaton was explicit about what he was documenting: people whose chief concern with handicrafts was the income they brought, because handicrafts were the only means by which they could earn money at all. Two markets then: the store counter and the craft shop. Neither of them saved the trade. Four things ended it, and only one of them was economic in the ordinary sense. The first was shame. Because basket making was what families did when they had nothing else, it came to mark them. Donald Fan describes the perception directly. Basket makers were poor people, and that perception was partly true, because people made baskets to trade for food. It was subsistence, part-time, fitted into gaps, and so a stigma attached to it. Once you could get public work, you did not need to make baskets anymore, and not needing to make baskets became the point. There is a bitter absurdity buried in that, and Fan names it. Basket makers were thought of as lazy. A person sitting under a tree with a knife looked idle, next to a person walking into a factory. In reality, turning a standing tree into a woven basket is an extraordinary amount of work, more than most factory shifts demanded. The judgment was exactly backwards, and it stuck anyway. The second was better work, and this is the part that is genuinely uncomfortable. When textile mills opened in the region, and women could take wage labor and piecework in sewing factories, they went, and Cogswell records that they were eager to go. Steady money, fixed hours, no hillside, no froe, no week of shaving. More than one basket maker told him plainly that she did not want her children to have to learn to make baskets for a living. That is not a craft being forgotten. That is a craft being declined, deliberately, by people who knew exactly what it cost. The third was the container itself. After the Second World War, Cogswell explains, synthetic materials changed everything. Glass jugs, then plastic ones, metal buckets, cheap, light, waterproof, replaceable. The demand for handmade baskets as objects to be used disappeared entirely, not shrank. Disappeared. The fourth was the land. The old arrangement, in which anyone needing basket timber simply went and found it, gave way to enforced ownership, fences, and posted boundaries. Access to material became, in Fan's assessment, one of the largest obstacles facing anyone still trying to continue. Take those four together, and the answer to our opening question is complete. The knowledge was never lost. It was set down, on purpose, by people with better options, at exactly the moment the object stopped being needed. And then something unexpected happened. A few women kept making baskets anyway, and one of them was Maggie Murphy. Cogswell describes how she was rediscovered by newspaper feature writers almost as a curiosity, and how, at one point, out-of-state cars were pulling up at the Short Mountain store asking for directions to her house. That attention changed things. Other makers resumed the craft, and they did not simply repeat what they had done before. They pushed it. Splits were shaved smoother and cut smaller. Weaves grew tighter, and the basket moved out of the category of tool and into something else. Some makers competed on size. Albert Thomas built one so large it would not fit through his own front door and hung on his porch for years. Others went the opposite way, making miniatures with hoops the size of a dime that still held the true egg basket shape. They called them show baskets. The craft that had been a mark of poverty became a mark of mastery, once nobody had to do it anymore. Whether it survives is genuinely uncertain, and the people closest to it do not pretend otherwise. Cogswell has said that the tradition faces the prospect of dying out completely. Fan has called it endangered while describing everything his organization has done to prevent that. But it has not gone yet. In Middle Tennessee, Sue Williams has spent decades teaching Cannon County white oak basketry to anyone willing to learn it, and in October 2019, she received the Tennessee Governor's Arts Award in Folklife Heritage for that work. Which returns us to where we started, a hand flat against light gray bark on a wooded slope, reading a tree that has not been cut yet. That gesture is still possible. The trees are still there. What is scarce is not white oak. It is the judgment. One last thing, and it is worth asking. These baskets carried no maker's mark. The signature was the wrapping at the ear. So if there is an old split basket in your family, somewhere in a barn or the back of a closet, look at the joint where the handle meets the rim, and tell us in the comments whether anyone still remembers whose hands made it.